even as everything's been changing, we've been very, very clear about our core values, and we've been very, very clear about our priorities. So health and safety, supporting families who are challenged so they can stay enrolled, supporting our employees, doing remote learning at a level of excellence, connecting our community across the distance. Those 5 priorities were our North Star, so that even if conditions changed on the ground, we still knew what the priorities were.
My guest today on Tell Me What to Say is Mark McKee. Would you tell everybody where you are literally and what you do?
Drew, thank you. And first of all, I'm very honored to be with you this morning. It is our first day of school for about a third of our students here at Viewpoint School. So, Drew, I'm the head and president of Viewpoint School. I'm here in my office on the campus in Calabasas, which is just outside Los Angeles in the Santa Monica Mountains. And Viewpoint is a K through 12 independent school. It is a co-ed day school, and we enroll 1,200 students from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade.
One of my favorite quotes about change is, "We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking that we used when we created them." Albert Einstein. So as I was thinking about that quote today, as I was preparing for Mark, it strikes me that, you know, as we confront new things, if our thinking needs to change, since we're all humans, that's going to play out in our conversations. And as any listener knows, this show is a conversation about conversations. So Mark, tell me then, if you followed my somewhat twisted logic there, how have the conversations changed at Viewpoint and in your life? A few examples or whatever as we have lived and worked through the past 6 months.
Drew, that's an excellent question. And my immediate reflection on how conversations have changed at Viewpoint and in education is, first of all, that there are many, many more of them. And it's interesting that conversations, broadly put, have been essential to our navigating educationally and navigating our community through this COVID-19 time. An example, one of the things that before we all, closed the school, went remote back in March of 2020, we had established a COVID-19 task force, as most schools, organizations have now. We had established ours back in January, February, and we had a couple of physicians, one our school physician, another a physician scientist in our parent community, both of them in our parent community. They were on our task force, and we wanted our students to have a little window into the science when this virus was something that might affect our lives back in March. You might remember that.
Yep.
And so we scheduled a conversation with our students in our middle school and our upper school for those, particularly the scientifically motivated students, to come and learn a little bit more about this thing. And certainly the rapid change, when we scheduled that conversation, we had no idea that even though it was scheduled for a few days later, that day that it was scheduled would be our last day in person on campus. And so, in fact, we had a Q&A on what was ultimately our last day in-person education last school year. And that conversation has spawned what is essentially a bi-weekly, sometimes weekly series of conversations, Zoom calls with our doctors from our task force and other people in our community. Our doing it with the parents, our having that meeting with the students during the school day. Some wanted to attend from home remotely. You know, that was novel back in March. So we did a Facebook Live stream of that Q&A. That turned into, well, if we offered one for the students, let's offer one for the parents. And hundreds of people turned up and continued to turn up. And we made a promise to the community, we'll keep these calls going so long as people keep showing up. And it has turned out to be one of the staples that has kept our community together and gotten us through. Even though they were getting information they might get from the media or they might get from, other sources, having physicians who were in our own parent community speak to our teachers, speak to our parents, speak to our community as insiders was incredibly comforting as the information has changed. And that's just one example of the way in which conversation has connected us during a time of physical distancing.
Yeah. Wow. So let's stay inside those conversations for a second. I wonder, you're both a participant, and I'm sure knowing you a little bit, you have the ability to step back from them and observe. What I'm intrigued with this idea of what is surprising us these days, right? Mm-hmm. As you really get a chance to listen. What has surprised you?
I've been surprised by how important it is to acknowledge how differently and how personally this pandemic is affecting people, and this time of change is affecting people. But actually, what's been surprising is that we couldn't necessarily predict how any one person was coping or managing through this time. And what that has meant to me as a leader is that we have to acknowledge and make space for all of the ways in which people are responding, reacting, coping, and managing through this time. And not only for our students, but also for our parents and certainly for our teachers, because people have been affected in very personal and personalized ways.
What is something, especially as the leader of this educational institution, what is something that you've observed somebody going through, and what has, if anything, this school been able to do to help them?
Probably the biggest thing we've been able to do has been to stay in touch, to communicate, and to let people know what they can count on in a time of great change and great uncertainty. And so being able to say, here are all the things we don't know, but here are a few that we're confident in, that has been very important to people. When we polled our community to try to understand across the distance how people were managing, we turned up that, significant numbers in our community, 5 to 10%, had a close friend or loved one who was ill with the virus, and a number of whom had a close friend or loved one who had died. And, because we, as a school, we're very much a community, communities gather. That's what they do in times of challenge or times of difficulty. And because we haven't had that same ability to gather, it has been very hard not to know what people are facing. And so, such techniques as conversations and surveys have been important so that people at least are known and seen and feel and are heard.
Have you felt that people are open enough? Is Zoom doing its job, meaning that people express themselves with vulnerability and transparency? Or do you think it might be different, in the presence of the people, say, in your office or something like that? Any difference you're noticing?
I think it does. I think that this, teleconferencing and phone calls have probably, have probably netted out to much the same, meaning that for someone who might not feel as comfortable in this medium, or someone who just simply gets Zoom fatigue and needs to have an old-fashioned phone call, there's been a lot of that lately. There are others who might, in fact, feel more comfortable in this forum and this format, communicating themselves and expressing. So, for example, one of the other things has been learning how to use all of these tools. So including like the chat feature in Zoom. The chat feature can be very powerful, or it can be a source of great risk and disruption when people are expressing opinions and there's one conversation happening on the screen and then a second conversation happening on the chat. We've had to get, and at the same time, we've in those Zoom calls, for example, we've kept open chats for just that reason. We want that open channel.
Yeah, I get it. One of the number ones, of course, there's anxiety. I hear that. I mean, you and I always had the good fortune of sitting there in your office and working on things, but I'm all on Zoom now, right? Back and forth. That aside, though, people are still, as we said, people are still learning to share. And one of the, if not the dominant concerns that they talk about is their feeling of uncertainty. Not only what do I do to make it through now, but more than that, especially when you talk to people in leadership roles, people want to know what's going to happen. So that somehow it can fill in. It's classic leadership challenge. The future is not real. We just have to create some vision of it. How are you doing in your opinion, and maybe you hear from others, in communicating any sort of vision or a sense of a future so that people can feel better?
We have had to be incredibly nimble and agile during this time. And indeed, as I look at our team here at Viewpoint, I am so proud of how they have been nimble and agile and communicative and trusting in order to pivot and then redesign and pivot again during this period of time. One of the things that Drew, about education is that education is one of the most change-averse and risk-averse industries or, fields of human endeavor, and for good reason. Education as a field tends to be conservative and risk-averse because we're taking care of children, and so because our mission is to provide safety and challenge and growth for children and teenagers, for the youngest among us, that makes education by nature a very change-averse endeavor. And yet the entire school system globally has had to go remote and learn how to do it well on a dime. If you had asked me, even in the beginning of March, how long would it take you, Mark, to develop a remote school, I would have said, at least give us 2 or 3 years. And in fact, we had 3 days. And I'll tell you, we had 2 weeks of remote learning. We had a brief spring break. We rebuilt the entire remote learning system for the quarter that took place after spring break. We were still hoping last spring we'd get back in person. Then we had a summer. We have run a summer camp. We learned how to do that in a pandemic. And we've rebuilt our entire remote and hybrid learning system yet again. So that we had to prepare 4 different schedules and calendars for this school year, depending upon the extent to which we're able to be in person or in a hybrid format or fully remote. And it turns out that here in Los Angeles, schools are opening remotely, as they are in many parts of the country. And so even as we open this school year this week remotely, we are prepared this year to operate school in 4 different ways. And that has never been true before. So that sort of agility in a school or in a school system, that had not necessarily been designed into all of our systems. And I'll tell you, as you know, innovation, agility, change requires collaboration and really, really good communication.
Yeah. I'm struck by something one of our other guests, a rabbi, has said in one of his books, and you're facing it square on, that When you must, you can. And you were faced with a a very strong and clear must. And it certainly sounds from your couple examples there that there wasn't a lot of time taken to talk about why it wouldn't work. It was more about getting to it. They said Martin Luther King didn't say, I have a dream, now let's break up into small groups and figure it out. But what you did was you and your colleagues got real clarity about what was required, regardless of the time pressures, and got right to it. And that's something unusual in organizations.
That clarity has been so important as to say, essentially, what is the mission? And mission is a word that, you might hear in a military context. It's like, we're going to take that hill. And your guest was right. When you must, you can. For example, in the spring, we were challenged to determine how to celebrate our class of 2020. And we had a mission to find a safe way to provide them a commencement, a conclusion to their school year. And, taking inspiration from the Air Force Academy, we essentially turned our football field into a field hospital, tested everybody. At that time, testing was not as widely adopted as it is now as a way of getting society back. And we provided the safety so that the class of 2020 could have a very different, masked, physically distanced, with lots of hand hygiene, touchless diploma distribution. But they could, parents weren't there, parents were live streaming in, but they could have a commencement. And that was essentially our phase one of what is the mission, So all along the way, we have said that we have a very clear vision as to what we're after. Today's the first day that our primary school students are having a day camp. And the purpose of that camp, the mission, is their connection with their teachers. And so even as everything's been changing, we've been very, very clear about our core values. And we've been very, very clear about our priorities. So early in the pandemic, we said, these are the critical priorities: health and safety, supporting families who are challenged so they can stay enrolled, supporting our employees, doing remote learning at a level of excellence, connecting our community across the distance. Those 5 priorities were our North Star, so that even if conditions changed on the ground, we still knew what the priorities were.
Right.
And we also ended up developing a sense of what are our core values for this COVID-19 time. So, like many institutions, we have core values, but we even developed them for COVID-19, placing among them science and responsibility and safety and community, because we were saying that as a task force, as a school, we're going to be led by the science. And we're going to be doing everything to put responsibility foremost, making it acceptable in our community as we begin to have some in-person education happening in the future. We see that for those who want to stay part of the community, and we're going to be doing in-person education safely and responsibly, and for those who choose to be remote, again, they can still connect and be part of our community no matter what format we're in.
Right. There's another quote I want to run by you, and to the listeners, I did not give Mark a heads up on this, so I'll even give him a moment to think through it. I do know I shared this with you when we worked on coaching together, and that was, the best leaders do this great job of this is from Jim Collins in From Good to Great, of balancing the brutal facts with the preservation of hope. Mm-hmm. And it's a precarious balance, but I'll put you on the spot fully knowing you'll excel here. If you could just say to somebody, within some range, what are the brutal facts that you now face as the leader of this institution. So be as brutal as you can be. And then what balances that brutality from the hope side?
Oh, Drew, I love Admiral Stockdale's paradox.
Thank you. That's good.
Yep. In fact, I began sharing that Stockdale paradox with our students and our families at the beginning of the pandemic. Because as you know, Drew, Admiral Stockdale said in that story recounted that the people who didn't make it out of that POW camp in Vietnam were the ones whose hope was such that, we'll get home by Christmas or by the next holiday, or the ones who didn't have any hope at all. I took a line from a poem. Be joyful, though you have considered all the facts. So many of the facts in education are very, very challenging. We have, not just at Viewpoint, but in our field, never done this before. So if we focus on teaching and learning, we're all of us learning together how to connect, how to deliver education and growth and human connection in this remote way. And so naturally, when you're learning anything new, you're not very good at it at the start. And no one who goes into education likes to be not good at something ever. We expect our students to have a growth mindset, but teachers generally were good students, and so we like to excel at things. But so being in a massive experiment, massive learning, that has itself been a bit of a brutal fact. Certainly, we must remember as we watch the tolls, and it's very, very hard when human lives become numbers and statistics. We must remember the ways in which this pandemic is affecting everyone in very, very personal ways. And right behind that is the brutal fact that it's fallen on our society in inequitable ways. And so that is a very challenging, brutal fact. And then there's the fact that we don't know what the future holds. We don't know how long it will be before we can move as a society to the next normal. And we don't know how long even this current normal will be before we find yet another version of it. So I think right now we're all finding some equilibrium and stasis in how to navigate through this interim period of time while we have the virus among us and before we have vaccines and treatments and the next normal. And so all of those are really brutal facts. And yet what has given me hope and what continues to give me hope is the promise and possibility of human connection, seeing the joy of learning and growth in students each and every day. It reminds us why we're in this world of education. It is all about, seeing, as one of our teachers put it, those light bulb moments, seeing students connect with one another and with their teachers. I reminded our faculty and our students that, great teachers change lives, and that is still true at this time. And so that is absolutely a North Star that gets us through.
Between Einstein and Collins and your extremely quick catch of the Stockdale paradox, I'm so glad that I had the opportunity. We haven't seen each other in a little while, but it was great to pick right back up with you. And your school is in good hands. And I say that as somebody who is around a lot of institutions these days that are having different kinds of struggles. But Mark, thank you for joining me today. I hope this has been a good chance for you to take a breath before you hop back down and get going again. Any last thoughts before I let you go?
I started in education as an English teacher, and as a result, I was always teaching students about the power of metaphor. And certainly leaders depend upon metaphors to communicate to their audiences. You've mentioned Martin Luther King, who was masterful in his use of metaphor to motivate audiences. And I know I have continued to find, metaphor after metaphor to keep our community united and moving forward. When you're driving in the fog, or when you're going through a tunnel and you cannot see how long the tunnel is, that can be very disorienting. I think that's one of the brutal facts of this time. And yet, as a people, even in this time of division, this time of political crisis, economic crisis, public health crisis, we do have a North Star in our community, and can, know that we don't know how long the tunnel is, but we'll emerge. So I wish your audience many metaphors to get them through this period of time.
Thank you. So on that note, this has been Tell Me What to Say with our guest, Mark McKee. Thank you for listening, and I hope Mark's words and thoughts can provide, as a good leader does, guidance forward. So thank you very much, Mark.
Drew, thank you.